So I'm Fred Hebert. I've been SRE at Honeycomb for a bit over a year now, and I tend to enjoy incidents a lot. Most of the things in this talk are not original ideas. They're things I've read and learned from smarter, more experienced people, and that I've put back together after digesting them for a long time. In fact, I thought my talk title was sort of clever until a few days ago I figured out that it's an almost pure paraphrasing from a quote in a book I've read over 3 years ago. So I can unfortunately not give proper attributions for all these things. And I'm sorry about that. All right. So let's start with this. This is a quote that I'm using because even if errors are arbitrary constructions, they carry meaning and they are useful specifically to organizations. This is a paper called Those Found Responsible Have Been Sacked by Richard Cook. And the four types it defines are quite interesting. The first one is going to be the defense against entanglement, which says that the error or fault is a way for an organization to shield itself from the liabilities of an incident. By putting the fault on a given operator, we avoid having to question the organization's own mechanisms and we safely deflect all of that away. Uh, the second one is the illusion of control, which sort of tells you that if we focus on individuals and we create procedures to manage them, we can preserve the idea that we can make the world a safe place rather than admit that adverse events will happen and they will happen again, or they will happen somewhat differently. But it gives us the ability to promise that this won't happen a second time. Trust us this time. Uh, the third usage is sort of similar. It's also another one that's about comfort, and it's one of distancing. And it's this idea that we're going to be able to say this couldn't happen here, right? The other people have different methods, they have different capabilities, they have different technologies, and the sort of incident they've had couldn't impact us. We're able to make a distinction between us and them through picking error as a construct that we have. And the final one is one that's called a failed investigation, which, safety experts seem to see the concept of error, specifically when you mentioned a human error, as a marker that the incident investigation has ended too early. Uh, Things are more interesting to dig into once you hit the human error and you try to understand how it unfolds, what it means, and everything like that. But if wrap it in human error and stop there, this is mostly a signal that the investigation was a failure. So generally, error is useful as a concept, but as an investigator, it's specifically useful as a signal to tell you when things get interesting. They're not an explanation on their own. And so this sort of makes me think about a lot of the incidents reviews I've seen happen in the tech industry. We use the incident as an opportunity because the disruption is big and large enough to let us think about how we work as an organization. But natural framing that comes through it all is to lay the blame in the operational area. So we look at the top of this iceberg and we see the deploy, the alerting, the scaling, the people running commands and stuff like that. And this is what we focus on. And so we lay the blame in the operational area, but I don't necessarily mean it in terms of people fucked up, right? There's this idea of blame, of retribution or punishment. And we have this idea of a blameless culture where we're able to open up and discuss this without the fear of consequences. But I still like to call that sometimes shallow blamelessness, where every investigation still tells you that we're not punishing everyone or anyone at all, but we think the organization needs to improve in that operational area. If we keep only finding the operational area as the area to improve, then we might be missing something. And, there's a lot to do in the operational area. There's a lot of improvement needed. It's a really, really tricky type of work done in special circumstances, and it's worth constantly adjusting it. But stopping there is missing on a lot of possible content that could be useful. Right, everything that goes below there, whether it is a code review, the roadmaps, the training, who we hire, the type of experience we value, the priorities that we have, everything like that, essentially guides and puts and creates the setting where the operations take place. So people doing the operations are more or less thrown in a context where a lot of the big decisions have already been made. And whatever was tested, who was hired, what the budgets are, matter as well. And so the question then is, how do we go from the surface level vision of our incident, the operation stuff that's visible, and have that ability to go under the waterline and get a glance of what the organization is doing otherwise? So the first step that we tend to do is to start an incident investigation with a timeline. Something that lets us go back from the incident or its resolution, the thing that goes boom, or the thing when the smoke stopped coming out of the machine. And we start at the bottom and we walk backwards from there. We sort of have that causal chain. And there's usually a sort of mental framework we have with labels and names that come with it. Something is called a failure or an error, and this is when something goes wrong. We have a thing called a proximate cause, which you might have heard if you've had any sort of insurance claim to do, uh, where the proximate cause is the last one thing that could have not happened and prevented the incident from happening. And this is usually the person who needs to pay for something in road insurance and stuff like that. And then as we walk backwards, we have different turns. And we will walk until we either reach 5 points if we're doing the 5 whys, or at least until we find something convenient to blame, where it feels like the investigation has resolved itself properly. We have a good action item, a good way to prevent this from happening. We are content to stop there. And this is usually something we call the root cause. And really, this is where the error is often constructed, right? The perspective we have, the way we build this timeline, and the place we stop is all arbitrary. If there are systems that we don't like, components or pieces of software that we hate, they are likely to become a root cause because we are willing to change them. If there is a team that you do not trust or a human you don't like, it's going to be really hard sometimes not to think that maybe they had something to do with it. Uh, but those are all arbitrary, and even that concept of the steady state at the top is a shaky concept. Large systems are always in some weird degraded state, and in short, if you adopt this kind of framework, you're going to find what you're looking for. The labels we use, the lens through which we look at the incident, they all influence the way we build our explanations of what happened. So the overall system is not necessarily any of the specific lenses that we pick. It's a whole set of interactions. To get a fuller, richer picture, we have to account for what things looked like at the time, not just our hindsight-fueled vision of what things were like when we're looking backwards after knowing how things blew up. There are a lot of things that happen concurrently, a lot of decisions made to avoid bad situations that never took place, and some that did happen. And so if we look forwards going in that diagram, there's a lot of options that are considered at all times. But hindsight bias is one of the three things I have mentioned there on the slide. Hindsight bias is something that's similar to outcome bias, if you know about it. But essentially, it says that because we know there was a failure, every decision that we took and that has taken place before the incident will seem to us like it should obviously have appeared as risky and wrong because we know it leads to a failure. But that's only because we know that result, right? It affects our judgment. The people who are going down that path and deciding what to do were trying to do a good job. They were not trying to blow things up on purpose. So they were making the best calls they could to the extent of their abilities and the information they had available at the time. And we can't really avoid hindsight bias. If you've read about it, it's one of the stickiest bias that you can't get rid of ever. But we can be aware of it and try to minimize its impact a bit. One tip there is to look at what was available at the time and consider the signals that were visible to people then. If they made a decision that looks weird, then look for what made it look better, what made it look reasonable, what made it look preferable to alternatives back then. The other one there are counterfactuals. And counterfactuals, really, they're one of the trickiest ones to eliminate from incident reviews. When I first learned of them, it's just like, how can you even do a thing without thinking about the counterfactuals? They're essentially suppositions about the things that have never happened and will never happen. Whenever we say something like, oh, if we had done this at that point in time instead of this other thing, then the incident would have been prevented. And, this is useless because this is talking about a fictional universe that never happened. So the only way I found to work around that is to always put these comments in the future. Next time this happens, we should try this approach to prevent the issue, right? This casts the discussion towards a more realistic scenario, which is it might still happen. It's not something that has never happened and will never happen. How can we make this option more likely? How can we make the bad option less interesting? And in many cases, just casting these sorts of questions into the future makes them become useless. By changing something else in the system, it is no longer an issue that we need to consider in the future. So usually they're kind of a loss of time and not necessarily useful. Uh, The other interesting one is something called normative judgment. And normative judgment are close to counterfactuals, but you can spot them because they tend to be about what people should or shouldn't have done. And this is often happening around procedures or whether they were paying enough attention or whether they're competent. The engineer should have checked the output more carefully, and they shouldn't have run the command without checking with someone else first because this is what the procedure tells them to do. Well, they did the thing they did because it looked reasonable, arguably. So the risk with this normative judgment is that it assumes that the established procedure is always correct and realistically applicable to the situation at hand, regardless of what it was. It assumes that any deviation that people made or the adjustments that they made when responding were bound to fail just because they were not the procedure, and they ignore all the times where that happens and that works. So we can't correctly adapt and adjust procedures if we assume that it's always wrong not to listen to them, right? We can't improve tooling if the problem is always the person holding it wrong. So the normative judgment is a sort of a trick where if we assume that what is written down is correct all the time, and then whatever people will do is going to be wrong, and we cast that light back into other areas. All right. So, how do we get back into this? Well, the basic step is documenting what happened, right? It's looking into the incident and understanding what was going on. Incidents are high pressure situations where people are often tired, distracted, and thrown in there without necessarily adequate preparation. So failure and success tend to use the same mechanisms, right? I've mentioned before the hindsight bias and something called the outcome bias. Before we know something is going to fail, we're looking to specific signals for things to do. We have a background, we have some amount of training and everything, and we make decisions according to the things that we see, hoping they will go right. The outcome lets us know whether the decisions were good or bad, but the mechanism was the same. And so we need to look into how these decisions are made with the best of intentions to have any chance of improving how the events unfold the next time there's an incident. So this leads to the idea that you want to look into what is not visible into the traditional timeline that you have, because that's where the real work happens. So I call this real work because when we come to a task, we do it with a given understanding of things, a sort of mental model. And that mental model is the rolled up experience that we have that lets us frame all the events that we encounter. And it's the thing that we use to predict the consequences of our decisions. And so when we are in an incident, at some point something went not according to plan. So there was a surprise, which means that the world we are in and our mental models of the world are clashing. And so this mismatch between our understanding of the world and the real world was already there. And in that period of a gap where, there's an alert, someone logs on, takes a look, there's a big gap of 30 minutes, nothing happens in the incident, and then we find the solution and we fix it. That 30-minute gap is where people are actively trying to repair their mental model of the world. They're looking at all sorts of signals going, this is not going the way I thought it would. What is going on? And so whenever someone reports nothing relevant happens here, those are generally the place where you want to dig and look into active hypothesis generations, the place that we're looking at, the signals that we're looking for, because that's where the gap bridging is taking place. And this is where the incident becomes a very interesting window into the whole organizational iceberg below the waterline thing there, right? Because looking back at this iceberg and how decisions are made in the moment, that's what lets us glimpse at the values below the waterline and how they are in play. What are people looking at? How are they making their decisions? Again, I'm repeating myself a lot on that, but they are impacted by everything else that happens before, and that is below that waterline. So if you see two ongoing outages or two systems impacted during a single outage, digging into which one gets resolved first and why is likely to give you insights about what people feel confident about, the things they believe are more important to the organizations and the users, and their understanding of the system, right? Minor decisions about small prioritization reveal a whole lot about how we build an organization. If you look at who people ask for help from, where they look for information or where they avoid looking for information, this will let you know about the dynamics, social and otherwise, that might be going on in the organization. This can be because some people are central points of knowledge. Some people are jerks that you don't want to ask questions until you already have the answer. Some people are seen as more or less competent, and in some cases, you trust or you don't trust the state of the documentation as it is at that point in time. So this is why changing how we look and how we construct errors matters. If we do the straightforward causal approach of stepping back and finding something, we only skim the surface. We never get to look below that sort of waterline in how people do their jobs and what gets to be really mattering and significant at that point. So different framings they're going to have is going to bring different solutions. And it helps to ask the proper types of questions when you're doing facilitation. As a facilitator, your job is to listen to what people tell you, but there's always ways to prompt for more useful information. There's the Etsy debriefing facilitation guide. That's a great source. But here are a few of the questions that I like personally, right? What was your first guess here? What made you look at this dashboard? What were the things that we tried and didn't pan out? Once we tried this, what were we looking at as a signal? How were you feeling at the time, right? This reveals a whole lot of information and we don't ask it a whole lot. And I have a couple of stories there from previous jobs where we exactly had this incident with a gap of 30 minutes. And I asked the person who wrote the incident review, like, what was happening there? What were you looking at? And it was an issue with service A, and they told us they were looking at dashboard for service B. And then I sort of asked why were we not looking at the dashboards for service A? And it just told me, well, the data there is wrong and we never trust it. We get better insights by looking at the dashboards of another team or something like that. It's like, oh, this is absolutely great, right? I don't necessarily care about the action item for the cause you had. I also want to care about this sort of factor where you don't trust your data that you have and you have to get it from a different team. Let's look into this. That's interesting. A coworker at the same job had incidents repeatedly where they kept deleting production databases. And there is an admin tool in the AWS console where you have a list of all the tables, and he kept fat fingering it and deleting the production databases. And there were a lot of people mad about that, going like, we need to take their permissions away and we need to get rid of that sort of thing. There's an admin tool and they're not using it. They're clearly incompetent. And I took that person aside. I just asked, like, what is it that makes you pick the AWS console instead of the admin? And it just said, like, well, there's a staging table that we need to delete all the time when the tests get stuck, and the name is sort of dynamic, and I don't know what it is. And the AWS console has an autocomplete, and the admin panel doesn't. And that was it. It's just like, give that dude an autocomplete in the admin panel, and he'll stop deleting the production databases. It gives you vastly different sort of action items to ask these questions and look into the experience of people rather than going from the judgment. And preventing people from doing things. And so this slide here is a sort of a map that I drew in the early incidents that I facilitated here at Honeycomb, where instead of coming from a big timeline and things like that, we looked into just the structure and incident, seeing what spoke to us from it, right? So it's kind of a generative, nonlinear, and it's looking at what people were guessing at and just this sort of very, very destructured approach. And for me, this is the idea that a good incident review is more generative than about classification. So for example, when we look at the way we construct errors, it helps to consider how we construct our reviews. There's two types of research. There's a quantitative research and there's a qualitative research. The quantitative approach is one where we usually have the frameworks, the root cause analysis. We specify the things that we want to measure, like the MTTR, the impact, the severity, the costs of things. And we have this classification that lets us compare one incident to the other and look at trends and things that come up. But in general, while this is good to spot trends, they don't necessarily give you good ways to improve the system. The qualitative approach is the one I'm advocating for here, which is a deep dive into understanding how the incident unfolded, how people were doing work, what were the tricky dynamics and the messy details that were going on, because those are going to reveal the way people think and resolve problems, and will have more interesting ways to find improvements than you would have from just the metrics writ large. An example that I have for that one that was very significant to me, previous job, I get in there to have a history of like 40 incidents in half a year. It's too many. And we start doing a review of all their incidents review, right? And we're looking at them, and a lot of corrective items are all about adding more tests. We didn't have the proper test for that one. We're going to add a test so it doesn't happen again and whatnot. And so some of the early conclusions were just like, well, people need to be better at writing tests. How can we train them to write better tests? And the next time this sort of incident happened where tests were pointed out as the team as one of the problems, um, I just asked them, like, what made you feel that you had enough tests, right? At some point, you're writing software, you're writing tests, and you decide, okay, I'm done. This is enough. I'm sending the pull request. It's ready to merge, and people review and say, yes, this is enough test. What were we looking at? And the answer they told me is just like, well, we didn't have enough tests. In fact, we knew the software was buggy. It's just that we were going to ship late. And in this company, it's better to ship broken code on time than to ship better code late. And there's no amount of training for testing that will let your people correct that sort of behavior. You have to change how the pressures are being applied to your engineers, and bringing this back upstairs was interesting because the idea was that upper management was convinced that engineers felt empowered to stop production at any time and say, this is not ready yet, we're not going to do that. But the engineers themselves are just telling us, we're just going to get yelled at if we don't do it. And that was a significant organizational dysfunction that wouldn't be corrected by just training people to test better. And this sort of approach, this sort of shift is super interesting for that. So, in conclusion, the thing that I would say about this whole thing is that we have to understand the mess. If you have multiple incident reviews to run, really the thing you want to do is probably focus more on those that you think have the potential to represent a significant learning, right? If you have to look over doing many reviews shallow or one review in depth, I prefer the in-depth review in there. I want to see the messy details, and if you only have aggregates and average, you lose all the messy details. The mental models that people have is how they do their work. This is how they approach their suggestions, their actions, their predictions. And incidents are amazing opportunities to correct and compare and contrast the mental models between multiple people in your team, which makes them either more accurate or, more contextual. You have a better understanding of when a model is good and when it isn't. Uh, it's I would encourage people to seek understanding of how people do their work. There's always a gap between the work as we imagine it to be and how it is actually done. And the narrower that gap is, the more effective our changes and procedures are going to be. So focusing on understanding all the nitty-gritty details of work and their pressures is going to prove more useful than just having super solid numbers and making rules based on these numbers that don't necessarily translate into practice. And finally, psychological safety, always essential. The thing that lets us narrow the gap between how the work is done and how we imagine it to be is whether people feel safe in reporting and describing what they go through. If you don't have psychological safety and a decent amount of blame awareness, you're going to have a hard time getting people to report to you the things that they are doing. And you're not going to essentially be able to drive serious improvements because you won't be able to seriously understand the work. And so this is what I have. Thank you for listening to me.